Good morning. So my name is Stratton. I'm a Devops advocate at PagerDuty. That's about as much of I'm going to talk about PagerDuty. If you want to know more about it, talk to me in the hallway or whatever. So this is Fight, Flight, or Freeze, releasing organizational trauma. So really quick, I like to put a little content warning here. We're going to talk about trauma and post-traumatic stress. Not going to talk about specific personal trauma or anything like that, but just be aware that that's one of the topics in here. So, for some context, while I am a trauma survivor, I am not a mental health professional. So, this is not mental health advice. Don't take it as personal advice necessarily. I'm not a licensed anything when it comes to this kind of stuff. So, keep that in mind. So, let's talk about zebras. So, we have a zebra that's at rest, right? With no threat of predators, just chilling out, right? This is operating within what we call the rest and digest phase, right? It's these are the rest and digest functions of the parasympathetic nervous system. He's just kind of there, basically. All of the functions, all the biological functions are focused on digesting food, on breeding, on kind of doing all the chill stuff that zebras do when they chill out. Now, we introduce a lion. So the zebra is now being chased by a lion. So there are these drastic physiological changes occur with the activation of what's called the fight or flight response of the sympathetic nervous system. So the zebra's heart rate increases, the pupils dilate, there's large amounts of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline that are released into the zebra's bloodstream, right? And basically any non-essential functions stop, digestion, all that kind of stuff. The zebra's nervous system is preparing it to literally run for its life. So now, say the zebra gets caught, right? So at this point, its nervous system is overwhelmed, right? It has no further solutions. So this is the freeze response. The zebra's basically playing dead. So what happens then is maybe the lion moves on and says, okay, well, I caught the zebra, I killed it, it's good. I'm going to go try to find another one. So maybe now the zebra gets away. And what happens, this is, when this occurs, this is sort of like what we would consider trauma in humans. Now, let's say the zebra survives the encounter, right? So it freezes, the lion moves on, it literally shakes it off, right? The animal shakes. And that's resetting its nervous system back into rest and digest. So one thing to keep in mind, humans are not zebras. So if you take nothing else away from this talk, remember that we are not zebras. What does that mean? So humans have, like all mammals, like zebras, have an autonomic nervous system. So that's the thing we were talking about with the fight or flight response. But the difference is humans, we have a prefrontal cortex, right? Zebras don't have this. Usually, the prefrontal cortex is an advantage. Because this is sort of where executive function happens. This is where the prefrontal cortex is where we understand consequences, understand the difference between good and bad, same and different, these types of pattern recognition. So normally, this is an advantage. But the disadvantage is this is where we mentally replay traumatic scenarios, which activates our sympathetic nervous system, just like the actual real trauma. Our brains are kind of dumb, right? They can't tell the difference between real trauma and perceived trauma, or the memory of trauma. So Dr. Peter Levine says, animals in the wild, they're not traumatized by routine threats to their lives. But humans, we are regularly overwhelmed, and we're subject to the traumatic symptoms of hyperarousal, shutdown, and dysregulation. So again, this is the difference. Remember, we're not zebras. Zebras, animals in the wild, they can have a traumatic thing happen, and again, what do? They literally shake it off. They move on, back to rest and digest. But this is what's different for us. So if we kind of look at a healthy nervous system, something will happen. There's some type of activation because some event occurs that kicks in the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight response. and then we get past it, and then we kind of settle back down into rest and digest, and then this is repeated, right? This is what's called the window of tolerance. So the window of tolerance is where we live, right? This is a zone of emotional arousal that's optimal for well-being and effective functioning. So we can think about this as the parasympathetic, refer down there, that's rest and digest. This is where we're conserving energy, things like that. The sympathetic is where the fight or flight response occurs. Now, when we have undischarged traumatic stress, it looks a little bit like this. So you can see that we operate outside of our window of tolerance. And what does this mean, right? So you've got hyperarousal or hypoarousal. So hyperarousal is being kind of the stuck on. That's sort of the fight or flight. So symptoms of being stuck on are things like anxiety or panic. We have restlessness, digestive problems because we're not operating inside rest and digest all the time. But we can also get stuck off, right? And so once you get stuck off, that's where you start to see symptoms like depression, lethargy, exhaustion, all these kinds of things, right? This disconnection and disassociation. Because what happens is that traumatic event happens, and then that causes us to dysregulate and to either get stuck on or stuck off or kind of go back and forth and back and forth. So trauma is not simple. That may be the understatement of this entire talk, right? Trauma is nuanced. So the first thing is remember that trauma occurs when one's solution, this active response to a threat, it doesn't work, right? The nervous system has been overwhelmed. That's what causes trauma. And the nervous system activation is the same for real or imagined threats, right? It doesn't have to be a real threat for us to actually, for this to kick in. And what I perceive as overwhelming or my capacity for a solution may be different than what you perceive as overwhelming. So it's subjective and relative. So how does this actually apply to an organization, right? Where does the rubber meet the road when we talk about this? So this is fine. We talk about how it happens to individuals. But one of the things that when I was learning about post-traumatic stress and all this stuff, I said, kind of the genesis of this talk is I was talking to one of my friends and telling him about what I was learning about PTS. And we sat there and said, this sounds a lot like organizations I've worked with. And here's sort of the, little spoiler alert, if you're a developer advocate or work in DevRel or you give a lot of talks, you always go into this, you learn a thing and you go, how can I make a talk out of that? So, hence this. So this is so if we think about how this applies to an organization, if we look back at a dysregulated nervous system, let's think about how this could occur when a traumatic event occurs to an organization. And in this case, the analogy of a traumatic event is an incident or an outage. I'm not necessarily talking about, something that's personal trauma to people in the organization, but the equivalent of trauma to an organization is an outage or some type of an incident, right? So we can think about, first of all, there's hyperarousal. We talked about this. Hyperarousal is the fight or flight, is being stuck on. So symptoms of this, so if your organization is stuck on, a hyperaroused organization will display effects of constant vigilance, right? Sounds like they're fighting Voldemort. And they're hyper-aware of threats. And what this does is it's taking energy away from innovation, right? It's this, they're not moving forward. We're stuck on, right? It's sort of like organizational anxiety. We're always thinking about when's the other shoe gonna drop, right? What's the next thing? When's this gonna happen again? This is oftentimes reflected in how leadership approaches outages and issues. So how many folks work in an organization where your effectiveness is measured by how many SEV1 incidents you have in a month, let's say, right? If that's saying, we know we're doing a good job because we don't have a lot of SEV1s. Here's sort of one of the problems. So that's usually a scenario of a hyper-aroused organization. The downside of this is, as we all know, humans, we will game the system, right? So what ends up happening when you're stuck on is instead of a metric like mean time to resolution or mean time between failure or things like that, you start to actually have a more subtle metric that I call mean time to innocence, which is you spend most of your time trying to prove that this really wasn't a SEV1. So a good symptom of hyperarousal is, again, being measured according to how many, right? Doesn't mean you don't keep track of that thing, but it's not necessarily an indicator of doing a good job. You also will see a lot of wartime metaphors, right? A lot of paramilitary metaphors about the approach. And I'm not a big fan of that because it usually is, again, this like we're going to battle, right? And then finally, another symptom of this is this idea, you'll see a lot of production support teams in organizations like this, where you have a dedicated team whose job is to prevent outages, as opposed to kind of the more DevOps approach of, you write it, you run it, kind of. So production support teams are usually an indication of a hyper-aroused organization. Now, on the other side, we have hypoarousal, which is being stuck off in the freeze. So the thing is, these organizations are also unable to really proceed or innovate because they're so concerned, they can't move forward. You start to see a lot of analysis paralysis, a lot of measure 350 times and cut once, because they're just stuck in this, I can't move forward because we've had these outages and they make me afraid. So a lot of times we'll see signals that remind us of previous trauma, right? So again, we said that if we talk about from the human perspective in post-traumatic stress, our prefrontal cortex can't tell the difference between real or perceived threats. We also will see this happen a lot in organizations where, because something reminds us of something that happened before, we assume it's exactly the same. So we're looking for pattern recognition because that's what we like to do as humans, right? We want answers. That's why root cause analysis is so appealing to us, even though it's ineffective. So what we see is that these signals look similar to something that happened before, but the reality is our systems and the people involved and the technologies involved and the systems involved are so complex that these simple indicators that make us think it's something that happened before is usually inappropriate. So an example, how many people flew on a plane to get here? Okay. Assuming you don't have TSA pre-check, you had to take your shoes off, right? So let's think about where this came from. So December 22nd of 2001, this cat named Richard Reed, he decides to try to ignite explosive that were hidden in his shoes on a flight from Paris to Miami. Didn't work, luckily, right? So as a result, the TSA says, okay, we're going to start randomly searching people's shoes. And then in 2006, the TSA mandates that all passengers must remove their shoes before going through, because one dude ineffectively decided to think he might try to put explosives in his shoes. So they were continually looking for this same pattern recognition, even though there's no evidence of this actually continuing to happen, right? It's a complex system. It's not just one, it's less about that he tried to put something in his shoes than other indicators. So I really like this tweet, right? Says, so Jennifer Bray says, we have this saying in medicine that when you hear hoofbeats, the first thing that should come to mind is a horse, not a zebra. And it says this too cute by half phrase has killed so many zebras. And we have to learn to stop jumping on the first root cause, right? Something looks similar, like, it must be this because that seems like this thing that happened before. But our systems are complex. Also, look, hey, more zebras, right? So there's a theme. So what can we do to understand our window of tolerance as an organization? How can we identify when we are deregulated? So similarly, we have to be able to think about some of those symptoms that I talked about before, pay attention to looking for these patterns that might continue. So I'm not a doctor, but I decided to paraphrase Dr. Peter Levine's to kind of talk about organizations. So similarly, I say a resilient organization, they're not traumatized by routine threats to their mission or business. Non-resilient organizations, they're readily overwhelmed, and they're subject to symptoms like overreaction, shutdown, and lack of regulated efforts. Again, not a doctor. Now, one of the things to bear in mind is we talk about resiliency. There's a difference between resiliency and stability, and a lot of times people think they're synonyms, and they really aren't, because being resilient means that you're able to have things happen to your organization, and you can respond, you don't become overwhelmed, you're able to continue to move along. So, this is not a Warren G. reference, to date myself, but how do we take both humans and then by extension organizations, take a deregulated state and become regulated, right? So we can understand, we've identified that we're deregulated. How can we regulate? What are some of the things we can do? So one of the treatments for post-traumatic stress is something called eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's also known as EMDR. So what happens is the patient's difficult memories are offset with a positive association that's reinforced through external stimuli. So it's kind of this thing, you said there might have blinking lights, you might have little tappers in your hands or audio cues. While you're taking this positive association, you're able to actually look at this difficult memory and difficult traumatic memory, and then have this positive association with it, and then it's sort of pushing it into your brain to make this association by this external stimuli. Now, we can't do the exact same thing. We're not going to take all of our responders and put little blinky lights on them and say, try to remember this terrible outage and look for these patterns. But there's this idea that I've been talking about called organizational EMDR. So these are things that it would achieve the same result, where we're taking something traumatic, potentially traumatic, and having a more positive association that is then reinforced within how we actually feel. It kind of works into our organizational muscle memory. So one of these things would be game days, right? So what we're trying to do is make an association of outages and incidents and issues with a safe place. And game days can help do this, but they have to be done properly. So a game day is kind of a mock incident, a mock outage, and we're kind of practicing our incident response, right? So you need to keep these low stress and safe. The point of this is not to practice under pressure. It's not like to make sure you feel good about like when things are crazy and everything like that, but to associate incident response with a safe environment. This is business as usual. This is just a thing that happens. Because if we're doing this, we're reinforcing it, right? We do a game day, we have this, but it's safe and it feels good and it feels okay. So then when it actually occurs, we've made this, again, it's an organizational EMDR. So the thing is, when you're doing these explorations in a game day, there has to be guidance. So it's similar to meditation. So with some kinds of trauma, meditation is really helpful. But the problem is people go into their inner landscape and they're not prepared and they're not guided. They're going to encounter the trauma, and then what do? They don't know what to do. They can be overwhelmed or find a way to go around it. So if we don't have plans in place for our game day, we're going to get wound around the axle. We're going to start focusing on the wrong things because it's not a plan, as if we don't have structure to it, right? So the other thing is that in meditation for trauma, we can get what Dr. Levine calls bliss bypass. So, which is a way of avoiding the trauma, right? We're just so worried, we just feel so good doing our meditation that we actually avoid the traumatic memory. So if our game day doesn't follow our usual rules for incident response, we've made it too safe, right? We're not actually having that guidance. So if we think about planned failure injection in a game day, you need to run it like a real incident, right? So at PagerDuty, we have Failure Fridays, although they aren't always on Fridays now, but we still call them Failure Fridays because we like alliteration. So when we run our Failure Friday, what we're doing there is, so it's planned failure injection. We're going to we introduce some failure into and we do it live, right, into our production systems. We do this on the systems that we feel are resilient, but we run it like a real incident. We do our full incident response and incident command process. And the reason for that is it's good practice, and we actually know what's wrong because we created the failure. But this causes an organizational association of a safe place for incidents. This is also why you should run all of your incidents at their initial severity, right? So let's say something comes in, it looks like a Sev 1, and then you realize as you're starting to run the incident that you're like, oh, this is really a Sev 3. You still should run it as a Sev. I mean, you can push it down to a Sev 3, but let's say you don't run a full incident command process on your Sev 3s, you only do it on your Sev 1s. Run it all the way through, even though you may have de-escalated it, right? The reason that you want to do this is because you want to make it safe to be able to call a Sev 1 because we don't want to have mean time to innocence. But also, the worst thing that happens is you just got more practice. These things need to be just business as usual, so they're low stress. And we have to process our failure, right? So we talk about blameless postmortems, blameless retros, things like that. That's just the beginning. We have to process the failure and the outage through all the information that we have. And most importantly, this processing has to have a conclusion. And by conclusion, I don't mean like an answer, but it has to come to an end. It has to have a wrap-up. It has to be done. Because if we don't actually finish processing it, it's unprocessed trauma. And there's this misconception when it comes to trauma that to process it, we just have to get it all out, get it off your chest, right? The thing is, what we really have to do is integrate our experiences into the coherent whole. This includes telling our stories as well as changing our autonomic nervous systems. And in the case of an organization, this has to do with how we respond to outages and incidents. We have to process it all the way through. It's really important that we actually are telling our stories. That's how we process them. This happens for the individuals and for the larger organizations. I like to say that a write-only postmortem doesn't help anybody, right? So it's not just about publishing the document out there, but how can you make this more of a conversation? And I'll talk about a link a little bit later, but I actually, the Greater Than Code podcast I just guested on, and we talked about this in depth about how to make these more of a conversation and more of a storytelling function. So in top-down therapy, which is kind of traditional talk therapy, it starts with the emotions. Why do you feel the way that you do? This is very similar to looking for a root cause first, right? Then in what's called somatic experiencing, the body is worked with first, which enables this sort of titrated approach to the emotions. So similarly, during an incident, you're working to restore service prior to determining cause. The point of incident response is not to find the root cause. The point of incident response is to restore service, right? And you have to look at the whole system when you're processing it, not just starting with the surface emotions, which are the symptoms of the outage. So when we're trying to process this, if we start looking for root causes right away, we're only looking at symptoms. We're only looking at the emotions of it rather than actually processing it. So I'm going to kind of wrap up talking about some things called cognitive distortions. So these are exactly what their name implies. They're distortions in our cognition. They're perspectives with bias. They're irrational thoughts and beliefs which we unknowingly reinforce over time. So these patterns and symptoms are often really subtle. It's really hard to recognize when they're a regular feature of your day-to-day thoughts. So there's many as like 16 generally accepted cognitive distortions. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through all 16. I'm just going to touch on a few that might be causing issues in your organization. So first one here is this idea of polarized thinking. So this is also known as all or nothing thinking. This is seeing everything in extremes, right? It's either perfection or total failure. Remember that our systems are always in some state of failure or degradation. That's the world we live in right now. So we don't have perfection. So it's not like everything is awesome or everything is shit. It's kind of somewhere in between all the time. So you have to watch out for that polarized thinking. Overgeneralization. So we take a single instance and we generalize it into an overall pattern. So in a personal level, that might be something like, well, I got a C on that test, so therefore I'm really stupid and a huge failure, right? And I don't know anything. In an organization, it can be, well, we had a Sev 1 on this particular service, so it's completely unstable and terrible, right? And when we combine this with another distortion called the mental filter, this manifests as only seeing the negative and eliminating all positives about a situation, a person, or a system. Fortune telling. So we do this one a lot in IT. Tech folks love to fortune tell. So we feel like we have data that will be predictive. Hello, machine learning. So if we only know enough, we can predict the future, right? So the thing is, yes, we can start to get an idea of what is likely to happen, but guess what? Our systems are complex, and here's yet another thing. We can't predict the future, right? We don't have these powers. So we need to be able to understand that our predictions are not fact, but just one of several likely outcomes. And then we have control fallacies, right? So this manifests as one of two beliefs, either that we have no control over our lives and we're helpless victims of fate, or two, that we're in complete control of ourselves and our surroundings, giving us responsibility for the feelings of everyone around us. Both of these beliefs are really damaging, and they're both equally inaccurate, right? These are extremes. No one is in complete control of what happens to them, and no one has absolutely no control over their situation. So even in these kind of extreme situations where an individual seemingly has no choices in what they do or where they go, they have a certain amount of control of how they approach their situation mentally. This, again, manifests in tech a lot where, and so for perspective, I spent 2 decades in operations, so I can talk about my tribe this way, but we absolutely feel like as sysadmins that if I can just keep control of my systems and keep those damn developers out of it, that I will have stability, right? If I can have control, everything can be great. But we don't have full control over everything, even if we try to keep people away. Or likewise, we aren't in a scenario where we have no control. So resilient strength is the opposite of helplessness. Being resilient means we don't see things from a perspective of things that happen to us. It's a matter of what we can do going forward. A culture of blame creates a culture of helplessness. This deck and any of some supporting links and resources is available on my speaking page at mattstratton.com/speaking. I will tweet out a link to the deck too a little bit later. I would love to chat with you in the open spaces or out there in the hallway about any of your experiences with things of this nature, but thank you very much and enjoy the rest of DevOps Days.